Welcome and good morning, afternoon, or possibly even evening. I hope it's a better Monday than it is in here. It's fucking raining since like 4 days ago, but let's look at something cooler. Let's look at the other time capsule we are going to have. This time it's going to be about Mythic Plus and Ranged DPS. As we are approaching 9.1, as you know, in a couple of days, tomorrow, there should be the 9.1 PTR. So we're going to get closer to more changes, to several specs, more shifting of the meta, the balancing that Blizzard will do before the patch launches. So before we get to that point, we are going to memorialize this first part of the expansion with the state that the specs are in before we enter the new patch. So this time is the time for Ranged DPS in Mythic Plus. I have already pointed out a couple of times before that this expansion, Ranged DPS, has gotten more prevalent in Mythic Plus as opposed to the previous expansions. It used to be 2 melee DPS and 1 ranged DPS. Now in Shadowlands, for the most part, is currently 2 ranged DPS and only 1 melee most of the time. And what is also interesting is that if you wanted to look at the popularity of Mythic Plus and how well the specs are doing, you're like, okay, sure, just watch this, right? This shows you, this tells you that Marksmanship Hunter is one of the most represented specs in Mythic Plus. What it doesn't tell you when you look at something like this is that Marksmanship Hunter used to be at 27% and now it's at 19%. Or that, for example, Elemental Shaman used to be at 3% and now it's at 8%. So you are not getting the full picture. So let's start with the current situation of Mythic Plus when it comes to ranged DPS specs going into 9.1, and we're going to start with the bottom. Again, we're going to start with Demonology Warlock. So not too much very technical to say about Demonology Warlock, aside from the fact that they have low damage. That's literally all it is. You know, you were looking for some in-depth characterization of the spec, some analytical talk. No, they just do little damage. They have quite a ramp up to be able to pull out all of their damage. It has been made easier in Shadowlands. Basically, the amount of GCDs needed for Demonology Warlock to pull off all of their demons and start doing proper damage has been lowered, but even then, it is still not enough. You know, when you have to be the first, second, or third highest damage dealing Demonology Warlock in the logs, and you can't even beat some 10th, 15th, or 20th Outlaw Rogue or Fire Mage, it's a problem. You also have the problem, as a Demonology Warlock, that you bring things in the Mythic Plus key that other Warlock specs are bringing. So essentially, it only comes down to damage. Nobody cares about Hellstones, nobody cares about combat rest, because Affliction has that, because Destruction has that. You're not special, okay? You're not, for example, a Windwalker Monk, who's the only DPS monk that can bring certain things, like Ring of Peace. You, as a Warlock, are shared with other specs, which means, generally speaking, the best one is always going to be chosen, and in this case, Demonology isn't the best one, not even the second best, which puts them where they are right now. Talking about choosing a spec within a class, then we have Beast Mastery Hunter. Beast Mastery Hunter is not at the bottom as much as Demonology Warlock is. Beast Mastery Hunter is faring much better. Relatively speaking, they also are more, more competent, I guess, in raid encounters as well. Hunter obviously always have the advantage of being super mobile, being given all the shitty jobs because they can just do damage while moving. They have an immunity that they can cheese things with. Outside of the immunity, they're not very resilient, they're not very resistant, their defensives are pretty poor. I guess it's the price to pay for having an immunity. Although someone should have told this to mages because they didn't really get the message. So one of the issues of Beast Mastery Hunter is that a lot of their damage comes from Beast Cleave. By a lot of the damage, I mean this. Nearly, most of the time, a third of their damage is going to come from Beast Cleave. What's the issue with Beast Cleave? The issue with Beast Cleave is that it is one of the specs, Beast Mastery, that has gotten hit by the AoE cap coming into Shadowlands. So Beast Mastery has Beast Cleave, which hits up to 6 targets max. So whenever you're pulling more than 6, you are not doing as much damage as you could. There is a mage with Flame Strike, spreading Ignite with Dragon's Breath. There is an Elemental Shaman with Earthquake, spreading Chain Lightning with Overloads. You are just hitting 6 targets with Beast Cleave. This, of course, severely limits the possible output of a spec in Mythic Plus when you are going to pull more than 6 targets quite a few times, depending on your path and your route. So when you stack all of this up at the end of a key, the damage of Beast Mastery is pretty low. Even the top Beast Mastery logs, can't even break into beating balanced druids or fire mages, but even several other specs that we will be seeing right now. Similar to Demonology, they're not really brought after plus 20, plus 21 keys. They can't really break that level of keys. After that, it's mostly just Marksmanship Hunters if you are going for a hunter at those keys, which we will see is not really what people are doing nowadays. Then, after Beast Mastery, we go for a surprise. I wanted to go for my niche hipster pick of the day to subvert your expectations, and in the C tier is going to be Affliction Warlock. So let's just say that depending on the key and depending on the affix, Affliction can be closer to the B tier, can be closer to a perfectly okay, I guess, spec. But in general, if we consider that the vast majority of players want fortified keys, they want AoE-based keys, they want trash-based keys as their push keys, right? Not tyrannical. So we're going to put Affliction into the C tier. So Affliction has remained a very meta and very popular and powerful spec in raid encounters. We're going to see this when we go over our Time Capsule for raid performance of DPS specs. But for Mythic Plus, Affliction still has the issue that they are pretty slow at ramping up their dots, that the targets need to stay alive long enough for their Malefic Rapture to start pulling off some good damage. And in the logs, you know, it is highlighted. Affliction Warlocks do less damage routinely than several other specs that are going to be above them. Not just the cookie cutter specs you would expect as usual, like a Balanced Druid or a Fire Mage, but also specs like Arcane Mage, specs like Elemental Shaman and Shadow Priest. Affliction Warlock doesn't really match up to that. They lack burst. That is the biggest issue. They don't have a very powerful burst. That is their biggest issue. Their Dark Lair in single target can do some work. They are still very powerful in that, but when it comes to AoE, whether or not it's the actual burst they don't have or the time to actually pull it off, the result is the same. They can't quite match up to too many of the other specs in Mythic Plus, which is why for full drama points, we are going to go for the spec right above it, which is going to be Destruction Warlock. So recently, just last couple of months, Destruction has had higher keys being completed, higher level keys than Affliction Warlock, and on top of being used in higher keys, they also just have overall more damage in their keys. And it's not that, there's been a surprise build that nobody expected. It's not that there's been a buffed legendary in 9.0.5 that has made Destruction become way more popular. They're still using Relic of Demonic Synergy, which is very boring, right? It's very disappointing. It's very passive. It goes on of its own, It's not that interesting of a legendary, but Destruction in Mythic Plus can do a lot of damage. They have AoE in their toolkit, which has been severely buffed since BFA. Back in BFA, Rain of Fire was a joke. Destruction didn't really have powerful AoE. They only had powerful burst AoE, and that was mostly off of the back of their Infernal. Infernal plus Cataclysm was just the big brunt of their AoE. Now they have a much more sustained, a much more consistent AoE that they can pull off every pack in Mythic Plus, pack by pack. They can still go, by the way, for the Wilfred's Sigil build, the build that is going to massively reduce the cooldown of their Infernal, coupled with Reign of Chaos for many other mini Infernals, which is going to make their Infernal their main source of damage when it comes to AoE, or they can just go for their standard build, which is going to spread the damage more evenly between Immolate, Channel Demon Fire, Conflagrate, Rain of Fire, and be more evened out. Both of them are performing quite well right now. So at the moment, Destruction Warlock is performing quite well, at least compared to the other Warlock specs. You have to put things in perspective, always. Next to Destruction Warlock, we have another spec which is doing fine, although when it's the last of the Mage specs, you're still kind of feeling a little bit sad, which is Arcane Mage. So Arcane Mage, on a similar note to Destruction, is doing pretty well when it comes to damage. They can have pretty high damage. Overall, in Mythic Plus keys, they still have their strongest point, which is something you would think would make them very good, which is their burst, right? Because you have a lot of burst, it means when you have the big pulls in Mythic Plus, you can use your burst cycle and do tons of damage. Arcane can certainly do that. This is your run-of-the-mill Arcane popping all of their cooldowns in an AoE pool in like 15 seconds. That's what they can do. This is something that a Warlock, for example, since we mentioned Affliction, could never do. The continued buffs that Blizzard gave to Arcane Bombardment has made it a very powerful AoE legendary for Mythic Plus. And unlike Beast Mastery, which we have just put below here, Beast Cleave is capped at 6 targets, just like Arcane Barrage is capped based on the amount of arcane charges you're spending, and you can only spend 4. The difference is that Arcane Mage has a bunch of other abilities that they can use to hit targets in AoE. First and foremost, Arcane Explosion, When you look at this, it's great, right? An Arcane Mage pulling 23k, 24k DPS in AoE. Yes, what he's doing is just clicking Arcane Explosion, but it works, If you're looking for damage, you can have it for Arcane Mage. The issue when it comes to Arcane, of course, being the, lower popularity, lower playability compared to other specs is simply because we have put Arcane here, but we have not mentioned Frost and Fire yet, which is the issue, right? Whenever you play a class with multiple DPS specs, you have options. You can choose. And if Arcane Mage, while being perfectly fine and viable, doesn't happen to be the best one, or even the second best one in your class, it's going to be much less likely that it's going to be picked by many people, by many players. Now, this is not the case for our next spec into the B tier, into the middle of the pack, which is going to be Marksmanship Hunter. So, Marksmanship Hunter has dropped down the rankings quite a lot. Marksmanship Hunter used to be the spec brought alongside Balanced Druid and Fire Mages for months, right? For all the way, close to February and March, Marksmanship Hunter was doing fine. And then, number one, they weren't scaling too well with gear. And number two, they were also getting bug fixed. If you don't remember, I'm disappointed because I have mentioned this like 15 times. So at this point, I would be questioning your mental capacity. But Marksmanship Hunter has gotten their Wild Spirits bug fixed. Wild Spirits used to trigger twice with their Serpent Stalker's Trickery Legendary, meaning they were double hitting whenever they were doing AoE and single target. Of course, in single target it's much less relevant. It was much more relevant in Mythic Plus for AoE pulls. Since being bug fixed, they received a compensation buff, which definitely did not make up for this bug fix. It wasn't even actually kind of a nerf in single target, but when it comes to Mythic Plus, the money is in AoE. So Marksmanship Hunter was hurt by quite a bit. Their AoE is still fine, okay? Their AoE is still competitive. They can still pull off some pretty nice AoE parses when it comes to damage. Single target, of course, is still their main weakness. Before, their AoE was their super high strength. They were even beating Fire Mage in terms of burst when it came to AoE, which is what kept them up. Now their AoE, while still being strong, is just strong, and it stops there. While their single target is still their weakness. As I mentioned this before as well, Prideful was also kind of putting this even more on the spot because you wanted single target for Prideful. When we get to 9.1, there will be a new affix, so it is even more likely that single target will take an even higher priority in Mythic Plus keys because right now you have been having a much easier time clearing bosses because you're doing them with Prideful, so it makes single target less important, which was very good for Marksmanship Hunter. So they had to spend less time in their weakest part of the kit. So overall, as we transition from 9.0.5 into 9.1, it's not looking too nice for Marksmanship Hunters, honestly. If I were to put like 5 cents on predictions, I would say that Beast Mastery eventually was going to outscale Marksmanship Hunter, as it is written, in the WoW code, Beast Mastery outscaling Marksmanship. Now, exiting the B tier, exiting the middle of the pack, we go for the better specs, the better performing specs. The first one at the bottom, so the least of the top specs, is going to be Frost Mage. So, what about Frost Mage? About Frost Mage, I would say that they do a lot of damage. The problem is that Fire Mage still does a little bit more, which sort of nullifies the power of Frost Mage. That's basically it. If Frost Mage was in Hunter, then Frost Hunter would be the most played spec. If it was in Warlock, then Frost Warlock would be the most played spec. There are really other few specs that can match up the damage of Frost Mage. Unfortunately, they just so happen to be next to Fire. Now, I am not gonna judge Frost Mage's tastes when it comes to enjoyment of the spec, because this is your run-of-the-mill Frost Mage experience. You're basically an Ice Lance bot in Mythic Plus. You throw out your Frozen Orb or your Blizzard and whatnot, and you just click Ice Lance. That's what you do. It's pretty depressing, but the damage is very high. They are playing with Glacial Fragments most of the time, which allows them a massive amount of AoE damage in Mythic Plus. They can play a few times with Freezing Winds, which is also going to increase their single target by quite a bit. It continues to be a pretty boring spec. This is your other Frost Mage experience. They are very limited in their options of their talents, but the damage is certainly there. I think in the end, it's just about having to compete with Fire Mage. Because if you can play Frost, then you can play Fire as well, right? It's in the same damn class. I guess the only major advantage that Frost Mage has is the ease of the spec during things like Necrotic Weeks, or even Raging Weeks. So the ability to kite endlessly with very little effort because you just automatically freeze everything every time. So it makes it more, in the end, it probably makes it more valuable for you to have a Frost Mage for those weeks. But then again, who is pushing weeks on a Necrotic Week? Nobody. So unfortunate for Frost Mage. We could actually ask Frost Mages in the comments, would you take being a Flavor of the Month spec, a most played and most requested spec, if what it took was for Necrotic to become a seasonal affix? That's a question. I don't want, by the way, the Frost Mages to answer. I'm too afraid to hear their response on this. So let's just change subject. Let's go over to Elemental Shaman. Honestly, not too much to say about Elemental Shaman. They have gotten major AoE buffs compared to previously, before 9.0.5. We have covered this in Raid Encounters as well. Being able to chunk out more AoE has made their overall damage be higher, which means now they look higher in the overall rankings and whatnot. Mythic Plus was of course bound to be the same thing because of it's AoE centered, so you're gonna do well as an Elemental Shaman with those buffs. Your Earthquake now hitting for much more damage. Not only that, but you're not even locked into the same legendary. You can still go for Echoes of Great Sundering because of the damage of your Earthquake, or you can go for Skybreakers because the older BFA build centered around Storm Elemental is still very powerful in Mythic Plus, which means with Skybreakers, you reduce the cooldown of your Elemental, meaning more Storm Elementals active. It's likely still not as powerful as the Vision of Perfection, 3 procs of the Elemental for you to use Eye of the Storm in AoE packs, but it is still competitive. It just does a lot of damage in AoE. That's all it is. They retain most of the Elemental Shaman's, I guess, utility, from a stun totem to a slow totem. They can have a self combat rest, I guess we can say. They have Bloodlust, of course. They can off-heal. The amount of utility that they have is still there, and now they have much more competitive AoE damage compared to before. So it's a nice place to be for them right now. There is still the problem, the fear that Elemental Shaman doesn't scale very well. We are seeing Elemental Shaman doing very well right now, but don't forget that Elemental Shaman's mastery does absolutely nothing to Earthquake and very little to Chain Lightning when it comes to damage. Yes, it can do more when it comes to Maelstrom generation, meaning more Earthquakes, but the damage of your Earthquake is not going to increase with item level and with gear based on your mastery, which is a problem when Earthquake is going to be so much of your damage in AoE situations. Same can be said, by the way, for your Storm Elemental. Storm Elemental also can't overload, can't synergize with mastery at all, so there is the old usual problem of Elemental and scaling, unfortunately. Now, past Elemental, we enter the closest to the S tier we can get, which is Shadow Priest. I'm not putting Shadow Priest into the S tier simply because it is just not to the level of the 2 specs we have had in the S tier for the entire expansion, so it's only chilling in A tier, but it's at the top of the A tier. It's very, very high in the A tier, okay? So Shadow Priest has gotten a boost up in their damage for Mythic Plus because of Shadow Flame Prism. Shadow Priest was doing fine before in Mythic Plus, but was not as close as it is now to Balanced Druid and Fire Mage. They used to do extreme amounts of damage in the beta because of this legendary. Then this legendary was gutted. It was gutted to the point that Shadow Priests were just using the double power infusion legendary, which is quite depressing. Now Shadow Flame Prism has been buffed again, and now it has gotten back into the meta for Shadow Priest players. The damage of Shadow Priest is very competitive in both situations, in both damage profiles, AoE and single target. They do have much better burst compared to BFA. One of the major issues of Shadow Priest was how long it took them to ramp up, how long it took them to lay down their dots and then start doing proper damage, which in Mythic Plus did not quite fit very well. Now, because of something like the Mindbender using the Shadowflame Prism is pretty good high, quick on-demand damage, they still have Searing Nightmare for their pulsating AoE, which is very powerful because it's very immediate. You don't have to ramp up anything with Searing Nightmare. You have, of course, Shadow Crash for an extra, on-demand quick damage to be pulled out. Void Eruption as well, of course. Just, as a side note, since we went over Frost Mage and how depressing it was to look at their damage profile, look at how pretty the damage profile of a Shadow Priest is. Look at how nice it is. Definitely the best damage profile of any ranged DPS spec when it comes to the variety and the fluidity of the rotation. So congrats on that for Shadow Priest. Successful rework, we can say, of the class coming into Shadowlands. Also, it does look pretty well coming for 9.1 because they scale quite well. Shadow Priest has historically scaled very nicely, even when they were a meme, niche, hipster spec that many people still try to play and make work and never could because it was too clunky. It had too many issues, too poor defensives, bad mobility, lack of single target burst or AoE burst, all of these problems left and right. Now, many of these problems are getting fixed, are getting reduced at the very least, so their scaling becomes a pretty important thing. Yes, to be fair, they are still pretty bad when it comes to defensives and when it comes to mobility. Many of their other issues have been fixed or alleviated in Shadowlands. Now, for the S tier, absolutely no suspense at all. Absolutely no anticipation whatsoever, because in the S tier you have Balanced Druid and Fire Mage. Wow, what a surprise. So, Balanced Druid first, because they are not as high as requested as a Fire Mage is. The fact that you, as a Balanced Druid, put down Starfall with one button, spread Sunfire with one button, and then tab target a bunch of Moonfires, and you can do competitive AoE, is the main issue when it comes to Mythic Plus. A spec with such easy to lay down and consistent AoE shouldn't be doing as much damage as it can. What is even more problematic, you can say, for Balanced Druid is that they don't even have to go for a proper AoE build. It's not that they are going for Full Moon in Mythic Plus. No, they don't. Their damage is going to be competitive even without that. The main issue that brought Balanced Druid to be a little bit above and beyond what they used to be in BFA, and in BFA, by the way, they were still doing fine. They were still amongst the more represented Mythic Plus specs for ranged, is Convoke the Spirits. I made this argument before with Feral, except Feral was lacking a few other things to get to the level of Balance, but Balance doesn't. Balance already has those things, and Convoke the Spirits just brings them one tier above. And it is still going to look pretty positive and bright for the future, because as I mentioned, it is very likely that in 9.1 single target boss fights in Mythic Plus are going to become more relevant because of the lack of Prideful, and Balanced Druid's strength, despite having more than acceptable, more than serviceable AoE, their strength is still their single target, which makes it so that in a Mythic Plus season, in a Mythic Plus meta, where you want more single target, Balanced Druid is going to be even more requested. And this isn't even about just their damage profile. The real killer, I guess, the real breaking point of Balanced Druid is the rest, is the other stuff. The fact that they have Force of Nature, which is a legitimate 1 minute tank cooldown, a very strong 1 minute tank cooldown, it is insanely broken because it plays with the AI. I don't know if you have played many other games, but abilities and mechanics that fuck with the AI are always the strongest. Always. Every time when you can cheat the AI to do something, like confuse your enemies to hit each other, or spawn a target dummy, or spawn a copy of yourself and force the enemy to attack it. It's always the strongest because it cheats, It bypasses things like armor, defensive stats, damage taken, because you're basically taking none. You're cheating the AI to just ignore you for a few seconds, and Force of Nature is doing just that. You have Mass Entanglement, which is useful for a number of different affixes. It was useful in BFA, now we are in an even deeper kiting meta. Now it is even more important, and it can help you even more. You have Soothe, which is going to dispel enrages, which is also another cherry on top given to Balanced Druid. You have, of course, Combat Res, which is also very important. Why? Because the main tank, the meta tank, is Vengeance, which doesn't have a Combat Res. The other DPS specs being very popular are Outlaw Rogue and Fire Mage, which don't have a Combat Res. Other specs getting close to that level where, for example, at times Windwalker Monk, maybe Marksmanship Hunter, right now Elemental Shaman or Shadow Priest, all specs with no combat res. So it's either engineering or a balanced druid with combat res. And then you can close this all out with Typhoon and Ursul's Vortex. Two other very powerful abilities because, again, they cheat the AI. Why? Because sometimes the AI cannot get slowed more than a certain percentage. Sometimes they cannot get stunned. Sometimes they become immune. Typhoon and Ursul's Vortex just bypass that. It doesn't matter if you just stunned the target enough times to basically become immune to a stun, you can just Typhoon them away, which is going to function effectively like a stun or like an interrupt as well. There aren't really many other ways to function like Typhoon. You have Thunderstorm for Elemental Shaman, you have Holy Priests that can also do something similar. Ursul's Vortex is the same. It's basically just you, Hunters with Binding Shot, and Warriors with Spear of Bastion, more or less. So you have a lot of unique things that cannot be replicated by other specs. That's what makes you so unique. This alone would be very powerful. On top of the damage that you can bring, makes you like this, makes you the meta most requested and represented spec for Ranged DPS, together with our top one, number one, first, which is going to be Fire Mage. Well, not really much need to be said about Fire Mage, because I'm sure you're all sick of Fire Mage. You've all been seeing Fire Mage ever since the Eternal Palace. We are talking about nearly 2 years of basically Fire Mage domination when it comes to representation of Mythic Plus or raids. It's basically just been Fire Mage, so you all know this at this point, why they're strong. But yeah, the short gist of things is their flexibility with combustion. The fact that they can reduce the combustion by quite a lot, thanks to shifting power and thanks to kindling, that can basically make combustion go down to a 65, 70-ish second cooldown, makes it so powerful for Mythic Plus. I mentioned to you how many times how powerful Vengeance Demon Hunter is, because they can cycle very short cooldowns, pull by pull by pull, and other tanks can't really keep up with that. They don't really have 1 minute 45 second cooldowns. They're all like boomer tanks with like 4 minute cooldowns that don't really match up very well with the way you want to pull in Mythic Plus. Fire Mage is the same. Fire Mage has got a 70 second cooldown that you can use almost nearly every pull. And because of how strong it is, because, Elemental Shaman has a 1 minute cooldown as well. Stormkeeper. Is it as powerful as Combustion? No, it's not. And in a way similar to Balanced Druid, they can also bring other things to the group. It's not just their damage profile, which is it is even stronger than the one of a Balanced Druid. They can give you an intellect buff after Blizzard removed the scrolls. So this made a mage even more necessary to have. They can give you a crowd control in terms of polymorph, again with the unique type of CC, because something like Ring of Frost is a very unique type of cooldown. You have Dragon's Breath, which is an AoE incapacitate, which is very powerful because it is a unique type of cooldown. Is an enemy casting something that cannot be interrupted, like Fungi Storm? Dragon's Breath is going to interrupt it. Easy. They have, of course, insane defensives. They have Ice Block as an immunity. They have Alter Time to soak up massive amount of damage as long as it doesn't kill you. You have your barriers, of course. You have Spell Steal as well. You can decurse because, reasons, I guess. So all this together just make them the premier spec for Mythic Plus and for raids. And to be honest, it's been far too long. I fully admit I have Fire Mage fatigue. I'm fucking sick of seeing Fire Mages. I'm hoping that in 9.1, even Arcane Mage, I'm even gonna take an Arcane Mage becoming meta, if it means I don't have to see Fire Mages anymore. Please God. Please Blizzard, help me. Make me a solid here. I don't want to see Fire Mages anymore. Even Frost Mages. Even Frost Mages and their 3 buttons I'm gonna take over Fire Mage. For one tier though. After 1 tier, I'm getting bored of Frost Mages as well. And this is where we are. We are in this situation right now, getting closer to 9.1. Some of the specs are going to be having, I guess, more chances of overcoming the place that they are in. Others, more chances of, I guess we can say, becoming obsolete. It's all going to be about, number one, how well they scale with gear, how well they scale with powers that Blizzard is going to give us, as well as the balance tuning that Blizzard will pass before 9.1. How much is it going to affect all of the specs? That's going to be the main difference between all of these specs. For now, that's the position they're in. So, probably tomorrow is going to be the one about Mythic Plus for melee DPS, I think, and then the one for raid encounters for ranged DPS. Eventually, we will have to get to tanks and healers as well. So, for now, this is where we stop. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I think actually there is hope for Demonology Warlock.